Welcome to Module 5, where we will discuss how to deliver feedback to support and maintain proficient performance and address non-proficient performance. In this module, we will first go over the evidence-based feedback protocol from the text. Next, we will discuss how to deliver feedback in a functional way such that it actually acts as a consequence for the behavior you're targeting. Finally, we'll go over the expectations of the BACB for supervisors delivering feedback, as well as related ethical codes. There are a few relevant ethical codes when we talk about giving feedback. First, Code 4.06, providing supervision and training, which specifies that behavior analysts design effective, ethical, and evidence-based training procedures. Not only do we have to deliver the training, but we have to assess the outcomes of the training to determine whether our training was effective, which is covered by Code 4.08, performance monitoring and feedback. Behavior that was once effective, occasioned in the training environment, now has to occur in the natural environment. And as discussed last week, the best way to determine if that transfer of stimulus control and generalization has happened is through progress monitoring. However, we don't just loiter around and watch our staff and call it a day. We have to actually provide feedback to reinforce appropriate and proficient demonstrations of the skill or error correct non-proficient demonstrations. In fact, this ethical code that says that we have to not only give feedback, but give it in such a way that actually improves performance and in such a way that there is a documented paper trail. So while our focus as behavior analysts is on function over form, performance feedback is one of those areas in which we should also be paying special attention to the topography of feedback delivery because it does ultimately change the function of it. It's interesting because there's a lot of performance management and human resource literature that give us all of these kinds of rules of thumb that should that you should employ while delivering feedback, whether it's giving one positive note for every four critical notes, or the sandwich technique where you say one positive and then a negative and then a positive. But none of these are really empirically validated because when it comes down to is the idiosyncratic nature of reinforcement. So just like, attention is not empirically validated to function as a reinforcer for everyone, the way that we deliver our feedback is going to function as reinforcement or punishment differently for each individual. And so, as the behavior analytics supervisor, it's up to you to really understand how that feedback that you're delivering is affecting your trainees here. And just like if we were using praise as a consequence for our clients, but it wasn't functioning as a reinforcer, then you go back and change the consequence, right? So we would go back and change how we were delivering feedback for our supervisees. In general, though, feedback should provide both praise and correction for previously demonstrated performance, in addition to rationale for continued desirable performance and any changes suggested for undesirable performance. And this is because we need to make sure that we're really giving a very thorough description of the performance that we're specifying as correct or incorrect, because feedback when it comes to working with staff or something like that is usually delayed at least by a little bit. It's typically hard for us to get that really pinpointed, precise, immediate feedback and reinforcement like we would do with a client that we're working on with an instructional program. And the rationale piece is important because it really provides that establishing operation, that motivation manipulation, especially when skills are hard for staff to upkeep and maintain. So think about when you're asking staff to use really cumbersome, laborious data collection techniques. And for them, they need to see exactly why you're doing something as opposed to just checking it off their job responsibilities. So emphasizing the rationale for why they're collecting the data in an accurate and precise way and how it's going to impact your clinical decision making for the client can really help further maintain their performance, especially when it's pretty high response effort and competing with their other responsibilities. The other thing with feedback is that we want to make sure that we're getting recommendations for what to continue doing and what to discontinue doing, and how to actually follow through with those changes. So it's not enough to just say, do this, do that. Whatever changes you're recommending they make, you really need to problem solve and troubleshoot with them about how they can fulfill that expectation and go through those motions. And when it comes to recommendations for how to continue doing what they're doing, remember that your observations are just a snippet or a snapshot of what their performance looks like. And it might not always be um, that top notch proficient of a demonstration when you're not in the room. So it's great to even provide suggestions for acceptable variations or other ways that they can keep doing what they're doing and make it a little bit easier for them. The protocol discussed in the text was a 7-step feedback protocol, and it always suggests starting off with a positive or empathetic statement. And really, this is kind of what we think about in terms of our clients is almost like we're not gonna go in and present a demand or an error correction or something like that as soon as you first meet with them. You're going to spend some time pairing and start off with something positive, or at least commiserating with them that it was a tough session that you observed, so that you can develop that kind of rapport and condition yourself as a reinforcer for your supervisee if possible. And then they say, after stating that general kind of positive empathetic statement, specifying what was correct about their performance. So, really making sure that you're highlighting what was correct and what they did well. And one thing that's important to consider is that oftentimes there is no different. This is no different than how we are biased in evaluating our clients' repertoires, is that the incorrect things stand out and are most salient to us and are often the things easiest for us to remember. So it's important during the process of progress monitoring that you really take a good look at the anecdotal data in addition to whatever formal um, progress monitoring data you're collecting. So that if you're really struggling with something to specify that they did a great job on, you can still be sincere. You don't want to walk in and be like, wow, great job showing up today, because really they kind of blew it with every aspect of the plan. You want to make sure that you can always find something good um, to point to that had happened, but it's important to make sure that it's sincere so that they don't feel like you're humoring or placating them, and that what you're really wanting to do is specifying what was wrong and things like that. So once you sort of specify what was correct, then you go into specifying what was incorrect and why it was incorrect. And then how can they change that incorrect behavior in the future, which is sometimes best done through some kind of in the moment brainstorming or additional role plays. So that you can not only throw some ideas out there for them, you can give them the opportunity to immediately practice that. And at some point, they can even give you information about the feasibility of, trying out this new method that you're giving them. And this really goes to show that you're not just going through these motions for your job responsibilities of having to give them feedback, but that you're really invested in helping support them and helping them learn and do the best job that they can do as well. And after we go through specifying the correct and incorrect feedback, the protocol states that we should also be soliciting questions at this point. And this is really important because oftentimes, if we don't directly ask our supervisees if they have questions, they may have questions and think that they're just going to ask this later, or they're going to figure it out on their own. And they could end up coming to the wrong conclusion, the wrong answers, and doing the wrong thing again, and setting themselves up for failure. And sometimes you work in workplace cultures where questioning your supervisors is considered a no because if you're their subordinate, you're not supposed to ask them questions. Um, but as a supervisee, but as a supervisor, you have the power to set up the space and contingencies to make asking you questions salient. And so when you're soliciting those questions, you're not only showing them that, hey, you want them to ask you questions, but you're prompting it. And a thing I like to do when I solicit questions from my supervisees, before I even dig into answering them, or providing solutions or collaborating on solutions, the first thing I do is really providing some reinforcement just for the question asking itself, because that's really tough to do for some people, especially when they're in the room with an authority figure. So saying things like, that's a really great question. I'm glad you brought that up. I love the way that you're thinking about this already. It's so that just the question asking in general is really reinforced. Because the last thing in our field that we want is for supervisors to be trying to figure out a lot of things on their own, especially when it comes to making changes to treatment protocol. After you go through this process of giving feedback, in the text, they talk about how it's really important that you provide the next steps of performance monitoring, because this will also make sure that you're supervising those clear expectations for when you're coming back out to look at that behavior again. It helps keep those contingencies salient for your supervisees to improve that performance and not just kind of put this out of sight, out of mind. And this is a relevant example that we can all think of when we're in jobs and have yearly performance reviews. We get that feedback and we know that regardless of whether we apply that feedback and make progress towards meeting those expectations, it's not going to come up again for another year until we have our next performance evaluation. So by really explaining what the next steps are for performance monitoring, you're maintaining that you're that immediate application of the feedback and therefore become salient as functioning that way for your supervisee. Lastly, you should be ending on a good, positive, empathetic note. Again, I think really reiterating how much you appreciate your supervisor's time, their commitment, dedication, etc., to the job they're in, and that you're in there in the capacity of being a supportive role for them and not just to manage them. So taking the recommendations for how to structure feedback one step further, in this article, Lindsley describes how to structure both formative and summative feedback to really create the most probably corresponding behavior change. Summative, which I like to remember as summarize, is the summary of feedback you just observed. And you deliver it immediately after you observe the performance. In this summative feedback, you describe what they did right, what they didn't do right, or what was correct. And then you give the rationale of why it's important for them to continue to do the things correctly by really reinforcing that. And then also state why it's important for them to correct the deficient performance. And just as we discussed earlier, the rationale piece is really important for creating an EO and buy-in, and even helps generate some rule governance around these skills in instances where it's likely that the emission of the skill itself isn't producing reliable reinforcement naturally. Some people skip the why as it's related to the correct response, because it's like, why should I reiterate the rationale for something they're already doing correctly? But I would argue that sometimes if we don't really emphasize why it's important to keep doing what they're doing, they may shift their response effort to focus on improving the deficient performance. And what we really need is for all of it to come together. In this model, you give the summative feedback immediately after the observed performance, as I just explained, and then you deliver the formative feedback right before the next response opportunity. You can think about formative as for next time. And one of the reasons this model is really effective is because it bridges that gap if there's going to be a delay between when you give them the feedback the first time and when they have the opportunity to emit the skill again. So maybe you've had your feedback session with your supervisee on a Friday afternoon, and then you give them summative feedback, but they don't have the opportunity to work with the same client or run the same program and employ that relevant feedback until the following Wednesday. That's a long time to remember what you were told and to apply that feedback. So with this model, you would deliver the formative feedback right before that next session. And when you do this, you're explicitly stating what they should do, what they should avoid doing, and exactly how they can keep doing it right and fix whatever went wrong last time. This again is really important because this points to or can do problems. If you've trained someone but they can't emit the skill when needed for whatever reason, it's on you to figure out how to teach them to do it in a different, more accessible way without, of course, compromising the integrity of the program, because we never want our supervisees making modifications without our approval. That's not within their scope. What I really like about this formative assessment piece as well is that you can do a quick probe of whether or not they've accurately interpreted and applied the feedback. So right before you're going into this next session, let's role play real quick to make sure you're all set. That kind of thing can be used in this formative feedback. And it helps because it helps you as a supervisor feel a lot more confident in sending your trainees into these situations where it's so important that they apply the feedback and correct deficient performance on their part. Again, you'll see that this has a lot of the same components as the models discussed in the text, but the timing of the delivery is different. And if we know anything about behavior, it's that timing of the consequence is what makes all the difference. Speaking of timing, let's check in with Dr. Hoke and hear what he has to say about the conceptual basis for using feedback.
Hello and welcome to the fourth module in our Behavior Analysis Supervisor training course. I'm Dr. Theodore Hoke. In this module, we're going to go over one of the most important things that a supervisor does, delivering performance feedback. Now, we've already discussed the necessity of giving performance feedback in the previous modules, both in terms of necessity of doing so and a little in terms of how it's done. So why do we need to spend a whole module on this? Well, look at this. This is something I teach my students. What you see up on top there is time marching on. We know that behavior occurs in space and time, and while a behavior happens, and after that behavior, there can be a consequence for a correct response if that behavior was correct, or a consequence for an incorrect response if the behavior was incorrect, or a consequence for problem behavior if the behavior is one that we'd call a problem behavior. And we know the consequences affect the probability that the behavior will reoccur in the future. And we know that we get schedule effects like break and run responding when we deliver reinforcers on an FR schedule, and scalloped responding when we deliver reinforcers on an FI schedule. And sometimes that causes problems. And we know that we also have more than one schedule available to us at any time. So even though you may want me to respond on the schedule you control, if there's a better schedule available to me, I'm probably going to respond on that one. We know this. And we know that stuff happens before the behavior too, like discriminative stimuli that make particular responses more likely to occur at that moment, and discriminative stimuli that inhibit responses at that moment. And sometimes we provide supplementary stimuli, SDs or S deltas, we call these prompts, to get the behavior to happen under a particular circumstance, so we can get that behavior to occur under that circumstance and then follow it with reinforcement. And there are motivating operations that could precede or co-occur with the immediate stimulus, and these change the value of the consequences, and they change the salience of those immediate antecedents. And we have conditional stimuli, which put the three-term contingency itself under antecedent stimulus control. And then we have molar systemic variables, like parents' work schedules, which necessitate the child being awakened at 5:30 to be in the car no later than at 6, to be at daycare by 6:30 so the parent can be at work by 7, with the bus coming to pick the child up at 8 from the daycare to go to school, the bus taking the child back to daycare after school, and the parent picking up the child at daycare at 6. And this schedule of events and everything related to it probably having a combination of functions, not the least of which is setting event and motivating operation function. Well, this is what I teach my students we have to work with, and I tell them that this is great because this is all that we really need. Well, what's the most important part of that story? Out of all those variables, which is most important? I'm hoping you're saying the consequences, because that's the correct answer. It's the consequence operation that occurs just after the behavior, which itself occurs just after the antecedent stimulus, that establishes that antecedent stimulus as either an SD or S delta or neutral stimulus. And it's the consequence operation occurring right after the behavior when that behavior occurs on the occasion of that particular antecedent stimulus, when that particular antecedent itself has followed another event, but not when it didn't, that establishes that other event as a conditional stimulus and gives us more flexibility with our behavior than comes with conditional stimulus control. Sure, the motivating operations are very important. They make the consequences stronger or weaker, but really, without those consequences following the behavior and exerting control in the way they do, none of this happens. Well, consequences not only affect our clients' or students' behavior, of course, they affect our supervisees' behavior. We know this, but we need to think about our supervisees' behavior in these terms. Our feedback, which is often a consequence of the supervisee's behavior, is an integral part, possibly the most important part, in helping the supervisee to become a competent behavior analyst.
Now, the BACB has several expectations of supervisors, and let's take a moment to walk through those. The board tells us that a supervisor should be able to describe and demonstrate positive feedback involving contingent descriptive praise. Aubrey Daniels defines feedback this way. Feedback is information about a performance that allows the individuals to adjust their performance. So there is a difference between feedback and reinforcement, or feedback and punishment. Feedback is information about a performance that allows an individual to adjust his or her performance. Reinforcers are stimulus changes that occur immediately after a behavior that affects the probability that the behavior will occur again. The similarities are that these similarities also point to some distinctions in function. So first, there's the manner of immediacy. Reinforcers follow behaviors immediately. Feedback can come anytime after. Second, reinforcement and punishment are basic behavioral processes that function in a particular way. Feedback is a social event that is intended to function in a particular way. And not that our intentions determine whether or not something is a reinforcer or a punisher. It's how that event works that determines whether it's a reinforcer or a punisher. The point is, reinforcement and punishment involve immediacy, and feedback doesn't necessarily involve immediacy. All that being said, we do need to keep two things in mind. First, if the feedback is given immediately after a performance, it certainly can have the function of reinforcing or punishing that function, but again, only if it occurs immediately after that performance. Second, even if the feedback is given sometime after the performance has ended, the fact is that the person is exerting some behavior in accessing that feedback, and we want to make sure that person continues to access our feedback. So we're going to have to deliver reinforcement in a way that increases the likelihood of them engaging in the behavior of accessing feedback in the future. So one of the ways to do that is to make our supervisees glad that they've got the feedback and guidance from us. Now, there are lots of naturally occurring outcomes from things we do at work, but they may not affect the probability of whether or not we continue to do them in the future. And when it comes to behavior and need for change, those outcomes may not tell us whether or not we actually did the behavior correctly. For example, if your change agent sends you an email, the natural outcome that is salient to the change agent may be that the email shows up in their sent folder. However, what if they accidentally mistyped your email address? Now it could be sent to another email address, or doesn't get sent to anyone at all because the address doesn't exist, except that neither of these outcomes are available as information to the change agent sending the email. So they may not contact necessarily the contingencies of someone not receiving mail from them. Failing to provide feedback kind of leaves performance improvement up to nonverbal contingencies that the world sets in place and some that even we set in place. But providing performance feedback can provide some prompts, discriminative stimuli, conditional stimuli that make other more productive behaviors more likely to occur. And we can reinforce those. Feedback does function as a consequence. It's certainly a consequence in certain contexts, like whatever supervisory behavior precedes the feedback. And we want that feedback to, at minimum, reinforce that behavior. We want our supervisees to participate in feedback with us. Feedback can also function as a consequence for that particular performance for which the feedback is being given, when that feedback immediately follows that performance. When the performance happens and the feedback immediately happens, the feedback can very well reinforce or punish that performance or have no effect whatsoever. Feedback can also function as an antecedent, not for the particular performance that just happened, um, but for other performances, uh, for feedback to be an antecedent or for improved performance, um, without sort of lofty contingencies. When we're watching our supervisees work, whether in role plays away from the action or while they're working with clients and students, if we're able to comment on what they're doing well and able to give guidance on what to do differently as they're working, we're able to reinforce correct performances while they're working and able to correct not so correct performances midstream. Now let's move on to giving corrective feedback. It would be remarkable if our feedback consisted solely of telling our supervisees what they did right and congratulating them on their performance without never having to correct an incorrect performance. It would be great if that were the case, but if it were, our supervisees wouldn't need us and the supervision would only be a formality. Instead, supervision is a training experience. And in training, sometimes we need to correct our supervisees' performance. So again, the board reminds us that we are to provide feedback in a way that increases the probability that the supervisee will benefit from the feedback. What this means is a couple of things. First, we do need to correct incorrect performances and teach our supervisees what to do differently and how to do it. They do not benefit if we don't do this. It also means that we minimize the unpleasant emotional respondents that our corrective performance feedback might elicit from our supervisees. Um, Exercising care and compassion as an ethical principle is really crucial. If we care about our supervisees and about the people that they serve, we will not only correct incorrect performances and teach our supervisees what to do instead, but we'll do it in such a way that our supervisees continue to look forward to coming to us for feedback, and in such a way that does not have the supervisee thinking and behaving with regard to how badly we made them feel, but instead out of concern for performing better for their clients. So the board tells us that we begin by giving our performance feedback by providing an empathy statement. There's a couple of things about this. First, if the only time that you're empathizing with your supervisee is before you give them corrective feedback, then before long, that empathy statement is simply going to become an antecedent stimulus that says something bad is about to happen. Second, it's really important to only deliver an empathy statement or a compliment if it's honest and genuine. The supervisee will know if it's not. Your credibility will sink rapidly, and you'll have your supervisee doing things because they have to rather than because they want to. So give an empathy statement or a compliment only if you can do so honestly and genuinely. We'll come back to discussing modality in a minute, but right now let's discuss individual and group feedback. We often give feedback to individuals. If I'm supervising an individual supervisee, I'm going to give feedback to that individual regarding their performance. This makes sense. Sometimes we're working in a group and our unit of analysis is the group's behavior, not the behavior of the individuals within the group. So when I'm doing group supervision, I have my supervisees present their cases and I give feedback to the individual who's presenting the case on the quality of the presentation. In private, although I may provide some prompting and feedback as we're going through it if needed. Here, my unit of analysis is the individual, and I'm interested in shaping the behavior of that individual supervisee. Sometimes during our group supervision, though, uh, if I'm working with a group on group performance, for example, and if the group is putting a presentation together and working through some sort of data issue, or if I'm working in increasing the overall rate of completion of various projects with the group, when I'm doing this, the group's my unit of behavior analysis. And so I give feedback to the entire group in order to influence the performance of the group, not necessarily just one individual of the group, but with overall performance. When this is the case, it's important to consider applying group contingencies to the behavior of the group because contingencies are already there and at work, and we may as well actually manage those contingencies rather than leave them up to chance. So speaking of group feedback, sometimes when we have groups of trainees or change agents that all have similar expectations of the same performance expectations being met, we can actually put group contingencies in place that don't have to set all those independent performance expectations and corresponding consequences with each individual. Um, as a refresher of the different types of group contingencies, first we have the dependent group contingency, then the independent, and then the interdependent group contingency. In our dependent group contingency, sometimes called the hero contingency, this is when one specific individual in the group or a smaller subset of the group are the ones that really need to have their performance improve. But the performance expectation is consistent for everyone in the agency or the group. So if you think about the example of billing, this is a behavior that everyone needs to emit and everyone has to submit their billing in a certain way. But if there were only two people that consistently were doing it wrong, you can set up the entire group with a contingency and say that everyone needs to submit their billing by deadline. And if everyone can get that in, then you're going to have a pizza party or half a day off or whatever it is, right? As an incentive. But you're not actually monitoring everyone's performance. You're just monitoring the performance of those people who have not been proficient in meeting expectations in the past. So whether or not the group gets that pizza party or days off, whatever you decide, is going to be dependent on that individual or that small subset of individuals meeting those contingencies. And so what happens in this situation is you can have it where the rest of the group knows that this is a dependent contingency and there are only a couple of people actually being monitored, or you can keep it vague and say when you're setting up the contingency and say that you're going to randomly select a couple of people each week to monitor because it might be too cumbersome or not feasible to monitor everyone, which is why you use this. So you tell your staff or your group, that you're going to select someone to monitor every week and this person meets the requirements, then everyone's going to benefit from the incentive. And what happens when you do that is that everyone gets motivated to either stay on par if they're already doing so to begin with, or actively get better. And if they're interested in those reinforcers, they're also going to be motivated to help out people they might know are not doing it correctly. The people that are not doing it correctly in turn might be worried that they would be the cause of the group not getting their incentive, Or you can keep it vague and say that when you're setting up the contingency, that you're randomly going to select a couple of people to monitor because it may be too cumbersome or not feasible to monitor everyone, which is why you would use this. So you say that you're going to monitor or select someone to monitor every week. And if the person meets the requirements, then everyone's going to benefit from the incentive. And what happens when you do that is that everyone gets motivated to either stay on par if they were already doing so, and if they're interested in those reinforcers, they're going to be motivated to help out people that they might know are not doing it correctly. Meanwhile, the people that are not doing it correctly might be motivated to reach out for help to either a coworker or their supervisor because they're worried that they want to make sure that they're doing everything right and they don't want to ruin this for the rest of the group. So from a monitoring perspective, it's nice because you don't have to use the resources to monitor everyone, and it can sometimes aid in that collaboration. However, if everyone knows that the person who is the quote unquote hero of the contingency, um, because you made it public and then they don't meet the expectation, now you're looking at problems because you're looking at people getting cranky that they missed out on their pizza party or half a day off or whatever because of this one person. In the independent group contingency, you can think of this as every person for themselves because everyone has the same expectation, but it's only the people who actually meet the expectation that are going to be the ones that get that incentive. So anyone who gets their billing in on time is going to get the pizza party, and anyone who doesn't is not going to get that. And the reason that this is called a group contingency is because the same expectation and the same incentive is in place for everyone and really operating on an independent level, hence the name independent group contingency. However, what happens in this situation is really you have to make sure that anyone who has historically not been meeting those expectations is going to be motivated by that resource. Or they actually have the skills. So this can be a know-how problem because they don't know how to do it. Then no pizza party is going to help them learn how to do it. So it's really important that you make sure that those variables are considered and also that you can actually actively monitor everyone in the group. If it's going to be too labor intensive to monitor everyone, then you probably shouldn't use this type of contingency. But the other thing to consider is that depending on the actual problem that you're trying to fix, so say that you have people who are really getting into those extra incentives and things like that, and you find after you've implemented this for a little bit that people whose performance you really needed to improve haven't been affected by this contingency, so you decide to take it away. And then you're going to have some people who get really cranky because they were saying that they were pulling their weight. They were meeting their expectations and doing what they were doing, and now all of a sudden you've taken away sort of these lovely extra incentives of the pizza party, and you want to be careful of the kind of those group of how those group dynamics play out, because you don't want anyone to get mad or blame anyone else at the agency because they kind of blow it for everyone else. And that is exceptionally true in this last type of contingency. We're going to talk about the interdependent contingency, and I like to call this that we're all in this together contingency, because everyone has to meet the expectation in order for everyone to get the incentive. It's an all or nothing kind of thing. So what happens in this situation is just like in the other ones, you have to make sure that they have the skills to do it. And but for those individuals who don't have the skills, they may be more likely or more willing to reach out to a coworker or their supervisor for help because they don't want to blow it for the rest of the group. And that's not saying that you need to give the feedback publicly or post who has not met the contingency. You can just say, hey, you can just say, hey, not everyone met the contingency, so nobody gets it this week, whatever the time frame is. You also have to make sure that there's no dynamics where someone would be motivated to sabotage the contingency for everyone. So for example, if you have an employee who normally does their stuff on time and thinks that these incentives and meetings are a waste of time, So they're probably going to intentionally not engage in the behavior that they used to be engaging in the past, because they want to blow this for everyone so that the supervisor doesn't keep using the same type of intervention. And that's not cool, right? Because that's also not going to help other people get up to proficiency with their performance and meeting those expectations. But this is actually a really good social validity uh, data set for you, because there are often times that agencies and employees and supervisors use incentives and rewards that they think would be considered a perk or benefit, but they don't actually function that way. So it's really important to consider what you're dangling in front of your supervisees, because sometimes it can insult them or make them angrier and not want to meet those performance expectations as well. So whenever you're considering a group contingency, it's really important to consider the dynamics of the group before you put that in place, especially with high stakes reinforcers like bonuses, financial incentives, days off, because remember, not everyone may be into those things, or even if they are, everyone may be into them, but they hold different values for each person. So, for example, a $50 gift card may not hold the same value to every single employee. For some employees, it might not really break their day to get the gift card and not to lose the gift card and not earn that incentive. Whereas for other employees, if they were banking on getting that gift card because they were going to do their grocery shopping, that's going to hurt if they don't get it. And it's really important that whatever contingency you're choosing it in a way that sets up your supervisees for success. Now that we've talked about individual and group feedback, it's really important to think about the when and the where of it all. So in the text, they discuss formal feedback sessions, which usually follow a formal progress monitoring session and occur at a pre-scheduled time, as well as an informal feedback session, which, like the informal progress monitoring, happens on the fly. Both of these have their merit. With informal process of feedback processes, you may be able to provide feedback in a more time sensitive way and have more opportunities to have them practice correcting the skill right in front of you. And of course, it depends on your work environment, because sometimes informal progress feedback monitoring can be disruptive to the clients. Sometimes we actually find ourselves in an ethically dicey situation because of this. Um, you have a commitment to your supervisees, especially if they're training as BCBAs, but also the client. Do you take time out of the client's session to focus on the supervisee's repertoire? Hopefully, you're not billing for that. With formal feedback sessions, it's usually more delayed than the informal sessions, but you can really give it all your attention and focus. Plus, you have more privacy if you're giving feedback on a sensitive issue, like telling something they're not, like telling them something like they're not dressed professionally or something like that. You really want a more formal environment for privacy, and maybe you even want to invite another supervisor, your own supervisor, or someone from HR or some other objective party, um, not to help out with giving the feedback, but to sort of be an extra set of eyes for IOA purposes. That being said, we all come with a lot of baggage for being quote unquote called in for these meetings. Because it's like the kid that gets called down to the principal's office for something innocuous like forgetting his lunch and his mom was dropping it off, but everyone around him, all his peers and other kids did ooh, and like he was getting in trouble. So both formal and informal monitoring have their merits, and also depend on what else is happening at the time that you're choosing to implement them. And that's kind of why we have code 4.10 that says we actually have to evaluate the effects of supervision. We have to make sure that the way we're providing feedback is actually effective. And you should also be designing systems for your supervisees to give you feedback. Think about this as a social validity assessment, just like with your clients. You don't want to rely or only evaluate whether or not your program was effective, but you also want to know whether or not it was a good experience for clients. Same thing with your supervisees. You need to effectively manage their performance, but also do so in a way that doesn't make their work life miserable. Um, Obviously, students can't learn if the feedback isn't effective to change their behavior, but also if the supervisor is unwilling to change the way that they give feedback.